Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. My name is Mike Kingsella, CEO of Up for Growth. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon's headline talk from Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck. From cities to suburbs to rural America, the cost of housing and demand for it dramatically has outstripped the supply of homes as well as wages to support housing costs. Today, far too many Americans cannot afford a home to live well where they work, play, and gather. And Up for Growth is a national 501c3 member network that is laser focused on addressing America's housing shortage. Really honored to have Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck joining us. Lieutenant Governor Heck has worked with Up for Growth since really our inception as an organization, going all the way back to 2018. Then Congressman Denny Heck introduced one of Up for Growth Action's key signature pieces of legislation, the Yes in My Backyard Act, a relentless advocate for housing stability and housing affordability and ultimately housing supply. Then Congressman Heck worked very hard to champion that bill through the House of Representatives, ultimately to passage off of the House floor. In his role today as Lieutenant Governor in the state of Washington, he plays a pivotal role in the state legislature, leading Washington State's Senate as part of his responsibilities as Lieutenant Governor, with a continued focus on housing. In fact, before our session today, he was sharing some groundbreaking research work that his team in Olympia has been spearheading to further this conversation about how critical it is to eliminate systemic barriers to homes and ultimately create more housing options and more affordability for Washingtonians across his state. I'd like to, before we send it over to Lieutenant Governor Heck, I'd like to just encourage anyone on this presentation today with interest in joining our cross-sector member network, supporting the cause to address America's housing shortage and affordability crisis, to consider joining the Up for Growth member network. The link below and link provided in the chat on today's session will link you to a form where you can register interest in participating in our network and really joining a broad coalition of organizations focused on our mission to forge policies and partnerships to achieve housing equity, eliminate systemic barriers, and create more homes. Without further ado, would love to hand it over to the Lieutenant Governor to share his perspectives, both from a national and statewide perspective on the issue and policy solutions to get at this critical priority for America. Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you, Mike. Good day to everyone. Mike, nod your head if you can hear me and we're okay. Good. Your video just went away, so I have no idea if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you. And I shall proceed. Thanks for the kind remarks. When I heard that you had invited me to talk today, I jumped at the chance, not only because it gives me an opportunity to talk about an issue about which I'm passionate, but frankly, it gives me the opportunity to say nice things about this organization, which I feel deep in my heart. Frankly and bluntly put, I don't think there is a more important organization. There are a lot of very important organizations, but I don't think there's a more important organization in this country for advancing the issue of creating a greater supply of housing, especially affordable housing, than Up with Growth. They are data-driven, value-premised, effective as can be, and the newest, most important voice in this space in America. And I'm personally grateful for all of your work and frankly delighted to be here today. Now, what I thought I would do is kind of set forth for you before we get to questions and answer my 7 principles of the production of housing, of the issue of housing supply, especially affordable housing. These are the 7 principles that kind of guide my thinking about what the problem statement is and in general terms where we ought to go. So Buckle up, let's get started. Principle, none of these are going to be great shockers to any of you. I think some of them are intuitively obvious, but I hope packaged together and discussed in some way that might, if not be new to you, might be provocative in some ways that are different. So let's get started. First of which is this: provision of housing is a part of an ecosystem. We tend to forget that. We tend to think in terms of just one aspect of the provision of housing, whether it's shelters for homeless or affordable housing for low income or workforce housing or market rate housing. But the truth of the matter, this is an ecosystem, and all of these places are connected, and anything you do in one sector or one area is going to affect another. And when we go about developing and advancing policy, it's important to remember that this is an ecosystem and they all affect one another. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Number two, here's the heart of it, statement of the obvious as well. Housing is in crisis, and it is primarily supply driven. Look, God has not repealed the law of supply and demand. It still exists in this country and in this marketplace. And the simple fact of the matter is we have not created enough supply such that the resulting demand is pushing cost higher and higher and higher. And I want to give a little color to that from my own home state. But the truth of the matter is some of these examples I use, you could change the local name and apply a name in your state, and it would be equally true. Let's start, for example, with the median price of a home in Seattle, which a few months ago was an astonishing $738,000, which is, by the way, 26% higher than last year. That's approaching hyperinflation, frankly, from a housing standpoint. More amazingly, and again, I'm going to suggest to you that this isn't unique or completely unique to Seattle. In the first 6 months of this year, there were 580 homes sold in Seattle for $300,000, more than the asking price. 580 homes sold for $300,000 more than the asking price. Statewide, home prices are up 84% in the last decade. So stop and think about that. An 84% increase in price, and think about what wages have done, which has basically been stagnant, not much growth at all. Obviously, that gap makes housing far less affordable. Now I want to bring even closer to my own home, which is Thurston County, which is where Olympia, Washington State's capital, is. What's happened? There's a new formula, and it goes like this. Throw out a couple of the outliers that are listed for sale, and here's the new formula. List the house on Thursday or Friday, show it on Saturday and Sunday, collect your offers on Monday, and then on Tuesday, you choose from among the offers, always at a cost much higher than that which it's asked for. It's almost like clockwork. Average time on market is literally measured in a matter of days. And you know, people in the real estate industry used to say a listing for 6 months was equilibrium. And what they meant by equilibrium was the buyer didn't have any more of an advantage than the seller had over the buyer. So we've gone from 6 months to under 30 days in most places. And as I say, in my county, again, not completely atypical, threw out a couple outliers, and we're talking 10 days on the market. We're simply not creating new housing units at the same rate as either new job creation, net new job increases, or household formation. Those are the two proxies that we need to track in order to have some kind of a balance between supply and the demand. And this has been the case in the country for a decade. We've been underproducing since the Great Recession. You know, I think about the creation of housing like I think about budgets. You know, if you spend more than you take in a year, the difference is what we call the deficit. But the deficits over time is the national debt. And we not only have a housing deficit every year and have had for 10 years, but we have a growing debt as well, a housing debt as well. We know in our state we've been underproducing at probably 40 to 50,000 units per year. So it's important to note that this isn't just an issue of home ownership. It's an issue of finding shelter for anybody. If lack of supply drives prices up so much that they cannot buy, they stay renting. Then what happens? If more people stay renting, occupancy rates go up. And you know what go up with occupancy rates going up? Rents go up. And more people become homeless if they go up too much. And in fact, in our state, there was a study done which cited increased rents as the number 1 cause of homelessness. Now, we know that there are multiple causes of homelessness, and there's mental health issues, there's substance abuse issues, there's I can't find a job issues. The number 1 reason is that rents became simply too unaffordable. They were up 56% in the last decade in our state. Again, 56%, a lot more than wage growth. Principle number 3, again, self-evident. Nowhere is this more painfully felt than the affordable portion of the market. And count among those low-income home seekers and first-time buyers. You know, we all, I think, are guilty of kind of relating to these public policy issues sometimes in terms of our own personal experience. Now, here's mine. I bought my first home when I was 21 years old. I had a good job, decent paying, but not great paying. But I was able to buy it because there was a sufficient supply. I was able to begin building equity so that I could afford another home as time went on. But the truth of the matter is, people can't do that anymore because of low supply. Low income people are having a more and more difficult time taking that first step on the ladder of building equity. People with pretty good jobs in areas like Seattle can't afford homes. We call that workforce housing. And of course, it's because we're not building enough housing, period. And we're especially not building enough affordable housing. And again, this leads to increased occupancy, increased rents, increased homelessness. And let me just say one thing about this. This is my mantra, my 3-word mantra for this issue: pillow, blanket, roof. If somebody doesn't have a pillow to lay their head on at night, a blanket to keep themselves warm, and a roof over their head to keep the rain off, then any of those other issues in their lives are not going to be dealt with, because you don't deal with joblessness, substance abuse, or mental health issue if you're living under a bridge, or camping in a tent, or sleeping in your car, or even couch surfing. Principle number 4. Yes, this policy challenge is also about race and equity. In fact, big time. Look up structural racism in the encyclopedia, and you may find an entry about the history of housing policy in America. You know, overall, 66% of American families own their own homes. It's still the dream and the aspiration, as widely and deeply held as it ever was. 66%. 75% of white families own their own homes. 44% of black families own their own homes. And this is inarguably the central factor behind the staggering wealth gap between black and white Americans. And we all know this was brought about in large part by the practice of redlining, which the government sanctioned. So what does that mean? Well, home ownership is the #1 net worth building tool in America again. If your great-grandparents were effectively shut out of that opportunity, it means they were able to leave less to their children, your grandparents, and your grandparents to your parents, and your parents to you. And the truth is that the grown children of homeowners are 25% more likely to own their home than those who are not. It is a negative dividend that keeps paying throughout the generations, this issue of racial discrimination. I might pause at this point and mention that those 2 reports that Mike referred to that our office produced are available at our website. One is on the issue of just housing, lack of housing, especially affordable housing. The other is entitled "The Racial Wealth Gap is the Housing Gap." And I would invite you to go to our website where you can read either of those. Principle number 5. Here's where I speak the the dirty and painful truth, all levels of our government, indeed, even including the private sector, are involved in this, but local government is the front line. And I think we know that. We're not building enough homes because, in large part, local governments are making it too hard and too cost prohibitive. We're talking about issues of permitting and zoning and impact fees and how NIMBY forces use those tools to prevent construction. I think about this again in some personal terms. 20 years ago, my wife and I built the home that I'm sitting in now. It was on a fully developed street. All the utilities were to it. It was the only lot. It's in town. And our impact fees 20 some years ago were $25,000. Now, we could pay that, and we gladly paid that. But the fact of the matter is that that added to the cost of housing. And in my hometown today, it's estimated that you cannot turn a shovel of dirt to build a home for less than $42,000 in impact fees. That was the case a few months ago. Is it any wonder that builders aren't building more affordable homes? In fact, they're not building any affordable homes. It just doesn't pencil. And no, allowing for more ADUs, which I fervently hope more people will do more and more, is not going to solve this problem. It's a part of the answer, but it's not going to solve it. Principle number 6, the status quo is not an option. It is not sustainable. It is not acceptable. The fact is, if we do nothing, if we do not change directions, we'll simply get more of the same. What is that? You know what it is. It's more sprawl. It's the construction of more impermeable surfaces. It's more tailpipe solution. It means people are moving farther and farther away from their jobs. It means more for the cost of the infrastructure to support that. And obviously more damage to the environment. It means more 30-year-olds living in the basement, for goodness sakes. And it means more homeless as rents become more and more unaffordable, and more people deferring their first-time home purchase, thus lowering their long-term net worth and their retirement security, because home equity is a key component of retirement security. So finally, principle number 7, the problem is tough, and it's complex, and it can be solved. It can be solved. We're not helpless here. We know what the problem statement is. We're not creating enough housing units, especially affordable housing units. We know what we need to do. We need to build more housing units, and build them in a way that the median family can afford. Because again, housing is an ecosystem, and the more median family affordability, the more in equilibrium that market is, the more the rest of the market will be in balance. It's not rocket science. We need to do this. For my dollar, I am obviously all in with Up for Growth. I think we need to build more densely and build up, because I think it's more cost effective and it's more environmentally benign and therefore sustainable. But before we do those things, we need to make sure, all of us, that we have fully acknowledged the depth and magnitude of this problem, and that we preach, and that we witness, and that we represent to other people about what it is that we have to do here, and how serious of a problem this is, and what the consequence of doing nothing is. So for their part in helping to move the chains down the field, if you will, I want to finish where I began by acknowledging and thanking Up with Growth. But I want to thank all of you for being here too, because obviously you've given of your most precious commodity, your time, to tune in on this, one of America's greatest challenges and one of its most important challenges. Thank you so much for having me. I understand I am now available for questions.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. I'm Melissa Winkler. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at Up for Growth, and just want to echo everyone's appreciation for you being here, and thank you for your words. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone on the call has a question, please put it there and we'll do our best to get it answered. I was wondering if you could speak, so you came from the Hill and now you're working in Washington State, and I wondered if you could speak to the differences in your work around housing at the federal level versus the state level, and how you see those two sort of intersecting.
Well, the job of a member of Congress in part is to change laws, change the policies. That's not the job of a lieutenant governor directly. Lieutenant governor in our state is the president of the Senate, but doesn't have a vote except in the rare case of breaking ties. I do, however, have an opportunity to provide thought leadership, which I'm able to do in part because statutorily I chair the Legislative Committee on Economic Development and International Relations. We don't pass bills or budgets, but we can, I think, encourage people to think in certain kinds of terms about policy challenges. So that's the difference in the work that I do. Secondly, however, as I mentioned in my remarks, the fact of the matter is everybody's got a role to play here, local government especially, but also state government and the federal government, and also the private sector, and certainly the nonprofit sector. We have so many wonderful things happening by affordable housing advocates and low-income advocates and Habitat for Humanity type organizations, although there's only one Habitat for Humanity, that are chipping away at this problem. But part of the difficulty of this problem statement is because everybody's involved, there's this kind of amorphous nature. There's nobody that completely owns it that can move the problem forward very, very far, except I would argue local government is in the best position to do that.
Great, thank you. And our first audience question comes from Alex Horowitz, who asks, has there been work specifically in Washington State on the relationship between restrictive zoning and homelessness?
Yes, there has. It hasn't gone anywhere near far enough. And a lot of that has happened on a very decentralized basis. It's obviously the biggest challenge with respect to homelessness, which is as this unfortunate and tragic phenomenon has grown, communities are really have parts of them that are really resistant to the presence of homeless camps. But in this regard, I am incredibly encouraged by what I see happening. Again, I don't think it's anywhere near on the scale that we need to. You see, for example, the proliferation of tiny home communities just flowering left and right. I was down in Vancouver, Washington, my hometown on the Columbia River, just to the north of Portland, Oregon, last week to dedicate a new 21 tiny home place. And that organization is getting ready to break ground on a 54 tiny home community elsewhere in that county. And that's kind of happening in a lot of places. But again, I want to bring us back to, for as worthwhile as that work is, and for as much difference as it makes in the lives of the people who benefit from it, our challenge here is to scale up. And also, I think, again, to get back to my principles, that's a little bit like treating the symptom and not like treating the cause. And we have to make sure that we're treating the cause as well. Providing tiny homes for homeless people, which are most often done with wraparound or support services, doesn't in any way really solve the overall supply problem, which is a big driver here.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kimberly Adams says that you're the best speaker yet. So that's just, she doesn't have a question, but it's just some compliments. Faith Pettis asks, to move the needle, we really need federal assistance, both funding and programs. Has there been any coordination among states to help lobby for federal assistance?
No, they spend it pretty gleefully, or not actually. Let me qualify my own observation there. For example, one of my prime areas of advocacy in my last year in Congress was my bill to provide the rental assistance, because of course we all know what happened during the pandemic, and I'm pleased that the Congress did, in fact, provide many billions of dollars. But unfortunately, the track record on that is mixed. There are some communities that have been able to get it out to help the people who are affected. The county to the north of me is overwhelming majority of the money they got into the hands of people who needed it. But the county to the north of that, no names mentioned, Seattle and King County, did not get, I mean, they were still in the single digit distribution of that money a month or so ago. So there's kind of a mixed record on that. But yeah, states, I think, I don't know how coordinated it is, but states do obviously unfailingly advocate for increased financial assistance to the states to help meet challenges. And whether that coordination is particularly effective or not, I'm just not in a position to say one way or another. But for sure, they are communicating clearly and aggressively with members of Congress. We need your help to do this.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Lisa Goldsmith, who says, you've touched on two key challenges for this change: leadership and connecting all of the various entities focusing on the issue. Do you see a path to connecting these efforts and conversations to generate momentum and affect change?
I do, again, at the risk of, and thank you for the question, at the risk of being redundant, I think Up with Growth is a perfect example of how that can occur. And again, I want to go back to my long-standing, over many decades, premise about the most effective way to approach public policy advocacy, and that is to first sell the problem statement. So my favorite adage is usually attributed to Albert Einstein when he said the two most powerful forces on the face of the earth are compound interest and the status quo. Anytime you're advocating for a change in the status quo, you are by definition often creating people who at least perceive themselves to be winners or losers. And nobody goes gently into the night. So in order to create what I would characterize as an authorizing environment to change the status quo, the first most important thing you have to do is sell the problem statement. And the reason for that is you create receptivity among policymakers to take action. If you get them to the following kind of statement before you put a specific and concrete solution on the table, that should be your objective. And that statement will be, gosh, that's a problem. We need to do something. But if you lead with the solution, which again creates winners and losers because it creates the status quo, you immediately coalesce the opposition among those who perceive themselves to be losers. So I think the way to do this is to keep hammering the problem statement. And the problem statement here should be fairly apparent from my point of view, which is we need to build more homes of all kinds for all our neighbors. It isn't much more complicated than that. And we need to talk about the consequences of the status quo, as I attempted to do in my remarks to you. Who wants more sprawl? Raise your hand. Who wants more tailpipe pollution? Raise your hand. Who wants their 30-year-old to continue to live in their basement? Raise your hand. All of these things are the consequence of not changing the status quo. So sell it and keep selling it. And it won't be as though the opposition melts away entirely, but it will give you a strategic advantage in advocacy. I hope that at least in part answered your question.
Yeah, great, thank you. Janessa Chastain asks, I'm from a state with less housing-friendly leadership, and then in parentheses, Idaho. Have you had success in conversations with your neighbor states that we could build on? And she says she went to college with Bob. Go Willamette Bear.
Well, what's her?
Janessa Chastain.
Okay, good. Thank you, Janessa. I asked your name, so I'll be sure and tell Bob I said hello. Go Bearcats. Interesting that you both went to Willamette in Oregon. They've done some pretty advanced things down there, as most of you no doubt know, and taken some steps I wish Washington State would take in some regards, actually. So, we're learning from one another. It's the genius of our system. States are the laboratories of democracies, as we like to say. I don't know. I don't, Janessa, I don't know what to tell you or advise you about politics in Idaho. I just, I, that's a bit of a reach for me, frankly, because it's such a completely different political culture, and I really have no expertise. But I would resort to the playbook, sell the problem everywhere you go, um, build the coalition. That's the other key to advocating. Nobody does this on their own. The fact of the matter is, in our state, and I think federally, where we've had some success, is this politics makes strange bedfellows formula. We've had low income housing advocates and realtors on the same team. That's not usual historically. And so you need to think in terms of who else is affected by this problem that might benefit by moving the chains down the field and build the coalition. It's not going to be one organization. It has to be coalition based. Another positive aspect I think of Up with Growth, which is kind of an organization by definition, a coalition.
Yeah, great. Our next question comes from Kimberly Adams, who says the biggest building block to affordable housing is neighborhood opposition and a lack of courage on the part of the local electeds. Do you see a solution to this?
I do. Again, I think continuing to hammer the problem statement is a really important part of this. I think, we had some legislation at the federal level that could have helped in this regard, which would have required for receipt of CDBG grants that local governments had done certain things that related to housing supply. Wasn't even that they undertook the analysis was required, but not even necessarily that they would act in that regard. In the interesting irony and proof to my assertion that the status quo is incredibly powerful is local governments opposed even that. So the beauty of it, however, is that if we can get that, we may have gotten that, I frankly just can't recall. Lots of local government officials know. You've characterized them as not having the courage. Well, okay. The truth of the matter is they're doing a political calculus about voter sentiment. And I'll tell you how I refer to the voters as my bosses. So in some regard, they're fulfilling the duties of their office as they see them, even though the policy may not be best thing. And a lot of them know, and they want to do this. And the truth is, I've seen unbelievable courage by local government officials. We have a now state legislator in Washington who was a city council person here in the town where I lived, a woman named Jessica Bateman, who muscled through a housing fund at the local level over a lot of opposition, changes in zoning requirements, over a lot of NIMBY opposition, because she built a coalition and because she was persistent. So, sell the problem statement, build the coalition, support the people who are willing to make this risk and to expend their political capital in getting this done. I don't think, again, that we're helpless. I don't think that this is a problem we cannot solve. We know where this opposition comes from, and you're absolutely right. An awful lot of it is NIMBY. But look at the brilliant marketing of Mike Kinsella when he had us do the YIMBY bill. I mean, in and of itself, the name and then the effort in putting it on the table, and we passed that overwhelmingly before because members of Congress got it. So there is a lot that we can do here.
Great. And our next question comes from Jim Morrell, who says, you recently wrote a book called Sausage. There's the big sausage made in Congress and the small sausage made in local and rural communities. How do we most effectively slice the sausage on this issue at the local level to vividly connect a line and pound the problem statement most effectively?
Get people elected to city councils who get the problem. If you don't have them on the council, recruit them to run and then support them. It's real straightforward. This is math. If you have a 7-person or a 5-person city council, do you have 4 or 3 votes? I know that if this is the Jim Morrell asking the question, which I believe it has to be because he's only one of 3 people who are aware of my recently published book. He knows this well because he happens to live in a town where there is a lonely city council person trying to do the right thing here, and it's real difficult. His name is Joe. Joe needs allies. Joe needs other people on the council, or he needs people on the council to have their minds changed. So to some degree, this is like a lot of things. It gets reduced to political activism and the need to either change the minds of elected officials through the means that we've discussed, or to elect people who get it. And there are a lot. Thank you for that question, old friend, very much. We have some spectacular leadership in our state legislature on this issue. I mentioned Jessica Bateman earlier, but you're going to hear from State Representative Nicole Macri, who is just a champion on some of these issues, just unbelievable champion. And you'll hear from her a little bit later in the day. And I think you'll enjoy that very much. Get the good people elected.
Great. Our next question comes from Ryan Donahue, who says, you alluded to some changes that Oregon has made that you think Washington should follow. Could you share where you feel Washington should be following its southern neighbor and how we can best accomplish some of these changes?
Thank you, Ryan. Well, obviously, since NIMBY is, if not the overwhelming cause of our problems here as it relates to building more densely, building up, then state passage of legislation that frankly either powerfully incentivizes or mandates that local governments do the right thing. Oregon's done some of that. I think it's time that we did it. You know, this is that terrible kind of issue where because of all the kinds of opposition, we just kind of let it continue and the problem accumulate. And as I said earlier, it's so much easier to do nothing than to actually take the bit in our mouth and get stuff done. But we can't let that happen. The truth is, this is going to take effort, like occurred in Oregon in their last legislative session, and some of which occurred here. Didn't go far enough, but then again, this is not going to be something we're going to solve in a year or two.
Great. And this is not an audience question, but I was wondering, so we've seen a lot of passion around some smaller solutions, like you mentioned ADUs, but also tiny homes, these kind of smaller but somewhat effective impacts, but we know that systemic barriers are really what limit housing production. So do you have any advice or thoughts on how we can kind of garner that same passion and build those same coalitions around the big systemic change?
Well, again, coalition building. It's the sine qua non of actually accomplishing anything in this space, because the opposition is pretty strong, laser focused in some regards. So I just think we should never stop reaching out and bringing into it. You know, and Mike, in his description of the mission of Up with Growth, mentioned the issue of proceeding to do this, build more densely without displacing people. And the truth of the matter is that deals with the legitimate concerns of a lot of low income and especially communities of color, where neighborhoods have been gentrified at their expense. And Up with Growth's explicit mission is, we're not going to do that. We're going to build more densely. We're going to build up, but it's not going to be at the expense of communities of color through gentrification. Well, what does that say to you? That says that's another opportunity to build the coalition. especially to deal with these, frankly, 400-year-old issues of discrimination, but more recent as it relates to focused racial discrimination in housing. So, think about this. We have developers, we have low-income housing advocates, we have communities of color, we have realtors. Get a wonderful basis of a coalition to say enough is enough. Shelter is a basic necessity. And we need to build more homes of all kinds and all sizes for all our neighbors. That ought to be a more powerful statement than somebody who says, I don't want the house next door converted to a duplex.
Yeah, great. And Ryan has a follow-up to his question about what Washington can do to follow Oregon's lead. He says, on the local political will aspect that you touched on, what's the role of the state in affecting this? I've been saying that in Washington, we in Washington need that political cover to pass significant changes on the state level, and that mandating local communities do the right thing. So he wonders if he's right about that assumption that at the state level there needs to be some political cover, or how the state and local will interact with each other.
I think there are a lot of local government officials, Ryan, who would appreciate having the cover. They may not be able to testify in favor of that, but once received, they would relish it, even if it weren't a mandate, but an incentive. So again, I hesitate to say this because I sound so much like a broken record or highly redundant. We've got to get people elected who get this. This is a major issue. And I believe as I travel throughout my state that there are more and more people who get this. And I perceive that the NIMBY forces are declining in strength. They still win because they've got status quo on their side, but they don't win as much as they once did. So we got to keep the pressure up. In my work on economic development, and by the way, that's another factor here we should mention. Housing is an unbelievable has an unbelievable multiplier effect on the economy. This is good for the economy to build more housing units. It's good for the economy because the truth is, if somebody buys a home or rents a new unit for the first time, the expenditure doesn't stop when they hand you the keys to the door. You may want to replace the doorknob, add curtains, buy furniture, landscape the yard, et cetera, et cetera. So this is good for the economy to do more as well. But what I was going to say is this, we got to get more people elected who get this. That's the bottom line.
Great, thank you. And I think that's our last question. So I want to thank you again, Lieutenant Governor, for being with us and for your words of wisdom and encouragement on this issue. I'd like to invite you, if you have any closing remarks, to give them now, and then I think we'll go back to Mike Kinsella, who will close us out. But thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. My only closing remark is to thank all of you who attended again. This is really important stuff. And I appreciate your giving your time. I appreciate your listening to me. But mostly I appreciate Up with Growth for the incredibly good job they're doing at advocacy in this space, which I think is so important. It's important for the economy. It's important for issues of racial discrimination. It's important for issues of retirement security. It's important in so many regards. And so thank you. Thank you, Up with Growth, and thank you, attendees. Appreciate the opportunity to be here very much.
Lieutenant Governor, one last question. Your governor is a champion for the environment. Climate change was a big focus of his over the past year on the national stage. And I think that, in the housing space, looking at what has happened in terms of physical displacement of folks losing their homes as a result of the wildfires, flooding out here on the East Coast and in the Southeast, the connection between land use decisions, zoning, and climate is becoming ever more clear. I'm curious, as you all are working on climate policy in Washington State, are you beginning to see these issues around housing production and growth patterns start to play more of a role? And is it percolating, the discussion around housing supply beginning to percolate through the climate conversation happening across Washington?
If it is to any degree, I'm not aware of it. And I think I have my ear fairly close to the ground on that. So no, I don't think so. And in fact, Mike, unfortunately, I don't think that there is enough discussion about the overall positive environmental benefits of building more densely, building up, because of the issues of sprawl and impermeable surfaces and tailpipe pollution. To me, it is just common sense that if we can do things more cost effectively, which is to say lower life cycle cost of the infrastructure associated to support a person or a family, that yields less water pollution and yes, less air pollution, that it is a common sense direction to go in. But no, I don't think it is infused enough in that particular debate.
Well, we appreciate your time. We look forward to continuing these conversations with you. And again, Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for joining us today and kicking off our state-focused policy day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again, everyone who have joined us for our headline session. Just a couple programming notes on that point around climate policy and pro-housing policy. Encourage anyone who were not able to attend our session last week to call it up on our on-demand feature on the conference website. And to the extent anyone has questions about accessing that session, feel free to contact us here at Up for Growth. Beginning in about 10 minutes, we have our first state legislative panel session, which is going to feature a number of great state legislators around the country. Actually, we have a panel beginning at 1 o'clock Eastern and a second panel beginning at 3 o'clock Eastern, featuring 6 state legislators all the way from Maine to Hawaii, from North Carolina to Washington State, talking about different approaches and bipartisan cooperation and building those coalitions that the Lieutenant Governor spoke about during his remarks. So it sounds like there are a lot of questions around those dynamics of state preemption and state incentives and encouragement for local leaders to really take on exclusionary zoning and other structural barriers to housing, which we will delve deeply on in both of these panels. The first really focusing on the politics of zoning reform, and the second really focusing in on policy calibration and how to make the most impact through statewide legislation. So I hope many of you can join for those 2 panels. And again, if you are not able to, these will be recorded and made available to all registered attendees of the Up for Growth 2021 Virtual Summit. So again, on behalf of Up for Growth, on behalf of our whole team, we appreciate your continued participation and engagement, and we look forward to further conversations here at the summit. Thanks so much.